We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara in Meseches Horayos. This is Horayos Daf 5a. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah is discussing the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, talking about a situation again where the Sanhedrin issues a mistaken ruling, and then the majority or all of Klal Yisrael follow that ruling of the Sanhedrin. So we have now Machlokas Tanoim exactly who brings the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. Rabbi Meir says that it's the Bezdin that brings the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. Rabbi Yehuda says that each Shevet brings the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. And now we continue with the third Tana. Rabbi Shimon says Yud Gimel Parim. You're going to bring 13 bulls. What it means 13 bulls is each Shevet is going to bring the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, and the Bezdin is going to bring the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. And the Mishnah continues along the same lines as before by Avodah Zarah, specifically when you have a situation again of a mistaken ruling, and the majority of Klal Yisrael follow the mistaken ruling by Avodah Zarah. So there you actually bring a Par and a Soyer. So Uva Avodas Kochavim by Avodah Zarah, says Rabbi Shimon, Shlosha Asar Parim V'Yud Gimel Seirim. It's going to be 13 Parim and 13 Seirim. That's 13 bulls and 13 he-goats. Par V'Soyer L'chol Shevet V'Shevet. What it means is it's going to be a Par and a Soyer for each Shevet. That's 12. And Par V'Soyer LeBezdin. And then also a Par and Soyer that are brought by Bezdin, because again, according to Rabbi Shimon, both Bezdin and each Shevet is going to bring the Karbon or the Karbonos. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Shimon says, Shlosh Esrei Parim, it's going to be 13 Parim, Par L'chol Shevet V'Shevet, again, a Par for each tribe, Upar LeBezdin, and also a Par for the court. But Hamayu Dekulu Mefarish B'Gemara. The reason of all of them, of all these various opinions, is explained in the Gemara. And the Mishnah continues, Horu Bezdin V'Yasu Zayin Shvatim. Let's say Bezdin issues a mistaken ruling, and 7 of the tribes act in accordance with that ruling. O Ruban, or the majority of them, Alpi, and again they act in accordance with the ruling of the Bezdin, Mevi'in Par, so then they bring a bull, that refers to the Bezdin. Uvavodas Kochavim Mevi'in Par V'Soyer, and by Avodah Zarah they bring a Par and a Soyer. Divrei Rabbi Meir, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Again, Rabbi Meir holding that the Bezdin is the one that brings the Karbon. And Rashi explains, Horu Bezdin V'Yasu Shiva Shvatim, O Ruban Shel Kol Shevet V'Shevet. It means either 7 Shvatim are the ones that act in accordance with the ruling of the court, or the majority of each Shevet to Shiva Shvatim. It means the majority of each of the 7 Shvatim. Uchegon Dehave Ruben Shel Yisrael. And this is also, for example, when that adds up to the majority of Klal Yisrael. Again, Mevi and Par, they bring a bull. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. Again, the Svira Le, Bezdin, Mevi and Par, V'lo Tzibor. The point is, Rabbi Meir holds the Bezdin brings the Par and not the Tzibor. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Yehuda says, Zayin Shvatim Shechatu, if 7 of the tribes sin, Mevi and Zayin Parim, they bring 7 bulls. Ushar Shvatim Shalochatu, and the other tribes that did not sin, Mevi and Al Yadein Par, they also bring bulls because of the sin of the 7 tribes. Sha'af Elu Shalochatu, Mevi and Al Yadei Chotim, because even those that did not sin, they have to bring the Karbonos based on the ones that did sin. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Zayin Shvatim Shechatu, Mevi and Zayin Parim, Ushar Shvatim Shalochatu, Mevi and Par Al Yadeim. The 7 tribes that sin, they bring 7 bulls, and the other tribes that did not sin, they each bring a Par as well, because of the sin. Kilomar Par L'chol Shevet V'Shevet. It means to say, a bull is brought for every tribe. The Amar B'Gemara, and the Gemara says, the Zayin Dekam Rabbi Yehuda. When Rabbi Yehuda says 7, meaning 7 tribes, Lav Dafka, it doesn't have to be 7. Tehu Adin L'Shevet Echad Shechata Al Pi Horas Bezin Hagadol. Even if you had one tribe that sinned based on the ruling of the Bezin Hagadol, Shahashar Shvatim Shalochatu Mevi'in Al Yadein Par. The other tribes that did not sin do have to bring, because of that Par, they each have to bring a bull. The idea to come Rabbi Meir Zion is just that since Rabbi Meir talked about the 7 tribes, the EU boy Ruba Mamish, because he does require it to be an actual majority of Klal Yisrael. Come Rabbi Yehuda Nami, so Rabbi Yehuda also gave an example of 7 tribes, but really the same would be true if it was just one Shevet. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon says, Ches Parim, that it's going to be 8 bulls. Again, Rabbi Shimon adds that the Bezdin brings a bull as well. Uvavodas Kochavim, and when it comes to Avodah Zarah, Ches Parim v'Ches Seirim, it's going to be 8 bulls and 8 he-goats. Par v'Sar l'chol Shevet v'Shevet, it's going to be a Par and a Sar for each tribe, and Par v'Sar leBezdin, and again, as Rabbi Shimon says, a Par and Sar are brought by Bezdin as well. And the Mishnah continues, Horu Bezdin shel echad min hashvatim. Let's say the court of one of the tribes issues a mistaken ruling. V'yasa oso hashevet alpian, and then that particular tribe acts in accordance with the ruling of its own local court. Oso shevet hu chayiv, that shevet is obligated to bring the carbon. Ushar kol hashvatim peturim, but the rest of the tribes are going to be exempt. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. V'chachamim omer, and the chachamim say, ein chayovin ela al horayos bezdin hagadol belvad. The obligation to bring these karbonos is only if the ruling, the mistaken ruling, is issued by the Bezdin Hagadol, the great Sanhedrin, Shenemar, as it says, Vim Kol Adas Yisrael Yishku, V'lo Adas Oso Shev. It has to be Kol Adas Yisrael, meaning again the great Sanhedrin, but not just the local court, the local great court of a particular tribe. And Rashi explains, V'chachamim omrim, and the Chachamim say, Ein chayavim par el al horas bezin hagadol, avol shevet echad b'horas bezdino. But if you have one tribe with the ruling of its own court, keshigagas ma'asadami, so that's just like a mistake by an individual. Umavian kol echad kispa oseira, and each individual will bring either a female sheep or a female goat. Adas Yisrael, again the pasuk says Adas Yisrael, and as we've said before, Hainu Sanhedrin, the term Adas Yisrael refers to the Sanhedrin. Kolomar Sanhedrin Shal Yisrael, the Hainu Bezin Hagadol, that's the Sanhedrin of all of Klal Yisrael, that's the great court. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Yadu Shahoru, if they know that they issued a mistaken ruling, Vito Mahoru, and they made a mistake in terms of that ruling, Yachol Yuhu Chayav, and one might think that they are Chayav in such a case. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, V'noda hachatos, the sin has to be made known, V'losha Yivadu hachotin, and not that the sinners have to be made known. Rashi explains, Yadu Shahoru V'toma Shahoru means as follows. Kilomar, the Gemara means to say, or the Brisa means to say, Horu Bezin Shechelev Mutter Bebitul Mixas. If the Bezdin issued a ruling that Chelev was mutter, a mistaken ruling, and again it's a situation of Bittul Mixas, which is generally a case of Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, V'asu Kol Al Pihen, and the congregation follows their ruling, V'achlu Shogegin Chelev V'dam, and they eat by mistake both Chelev and Dam. Now the mistaken ruling was only by Chelev, and they ate Chelev and Dam. Echad B'shigagas Ma'isa Bilvad, V'chad B'hora. So this is a situation where one of them is just a regular Shogeg, and one of them is based on the mistaken ruling. V'achakach Yadu Shahor now after this they find out that it was a mistaken ruling. But they make a mistake in terms of what exactly was the mistaken ruling. They just don't know if the mistaken ruling was with regards to Chelev or Dam. So in that situation, would they bring the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor or not? Yachol Yuhu Chayav in Par, one might think they are obligated to bring the Par. The lahave hora ma'alya, that would be considered a situation of a real ruling, again a mistaken ruling, which is the classic case of a par helam davar shel tzibor. Talmud lomar v'noda hachatos, the pasuk says the sin is known. Asher chatu alev v'hikrivu, it says that the sin is known, which they sinned and they bring the offering. Kilomar ditzarech sheivada hachatos sheyoden al mahoru, they have to know what mistaken ruling they issued. Im al chelev al adam, did they issue the mistaken ruling with regards to chelev or dam? V'lo sheyodu hachot, and not simply that the sinners know, meaning that you know about the sinners. The lo sage b'yadia dechotin, it's not enough to know that they sinned. The avagav de asu behora the mimanavshach. Now in this situation, we know for sure one of these things was done by a mistaken ruling. Chad minayu b'hora ahav, certainly one of these was a mistaken ruling. To achli l'tarvayu chelev v'dam, because they ate both chelev and dam, and we know that there was a mistaken ruling on one of those two things. Nevertheless, afilu achi, nevertheless, peturin, they are exempt. It has to be clear which sin they did based on the mistaken ruling. And the Brisa continues, the pasuk then says, Asher chatu, that they sinned, and so the Brisa says, Chatu shnei shvatim, if two of the tribes sinned, Mevi'in shnei parim, they bring two bulls. Chatu shlosha, if three of the tribes sinned, Mevi'in shlosha, they bring three bulls. Oeino omer ela chatu shnei yechidim, Mevi'in shnei parim, but maybe what it means is that if two individuals sin, they bring two bulls. Chatu gimel, Mevi'in gimel, if three sin, then they bring three bulls. Talmud lomar hakohol, the pasuk says, the community, the congregation, hakohol chayiv, it means to say that the congregation is chayiv, v'chol kahol ukol chayiv, and each congregation individually, so to speak, is chayiv. Keitzad how so? Chatu shnei shvatim mevi'in shnei parim, if two tribes sin, they bring two bulls. Chatu zayin mevi'in zayin, if seven tribes sin, they bring seven bulls. Ushar shvatim shelo chatu, and the rest of the tribes that didn't sin, mevi'in al yedein par, they also each have to bring a bull. Shafilu elo shelo chatu mevi'in al yedei hachotin, even those that didn't sin, they have to bring because of those who did sin. Lakach nemar kohol, that's why it says congregation. L'chayiv al kol kohol ukol, to say that you're chayiv, that each congregation is chayiv. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rashi explains, Chatu shnei shvatim mevi'in beis parim, if two tribes sin, so you bring two bulls. V'hu adin dechi chat shei v'echad, and the same is true. Let's say one tribe sins, shemevi par echad brings one bull. V'al kamash molon, it's teaching us the shnei shvatim lo sagi lu b'par echad. The point is that two tribes, it's not enough just to bring one bull. Each tribe has to bring a bull. L'chayiv al kol kohol v'kol, in order to say that each congregation is going to be chayiv, the shevet echad ikri kol, because one tribe is called a kohol, it's called a congregation. Like we'll explain the reason later on. And the Brisa continues, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Zayin Shvatim Shechatu, if you have 7 tribes that sin, Mevian Zayin Parim, they bring 7 bulls, Ubezdin Mevian Al Yedayin Par, and then the Bezdin as well, they also bring a bull, Shenamar Lamata Kol, because it says below the word Kahol, V'namar Lamala Kol, and it says above the word Kahol, Makol Ha'amar Lamala Bezdinim HaKol, just like the word Kol that said above is the court together with the congregation, Af Kol Ha'amar Lamata Bezdinim HaKol. So too, when it says congregation below, it means the court together with the congregation. And Rashi explains, Mahakol ha'amar lamala bezinim hakol, just like over there it means the bezin together. The tarvayu ksiv lamala bezinim hakol. Earlier in the pasuk it says both. It says the court and the community. The chsiv it says v'nelam davar me'enei hakol. It says from the eyes of the congregation. Dehai me'enei hainu bezin. So the word me'enei, the eyes of the congregation, that refers to the courts, and hakol refers to the congregation. So it's mentioning both. So af kol ha'amar lamata. So too when it says below, by the actual bringing of the carbon, it says v'hikrivu hakol bezdin im hakol. It says that the kol brings, it means the bezdin with the kol. In other words, when it says v'nelam davar, that's talking about the lapse of awareness, the mistake that they made. It mentions both the court, because me'ene means the court, and it mentions the congregation. And so therefore, by the offering as well, when it says hakol, we understand that to mean the bezdin with the congregation. They both bring the carbon. And the Brisa continues, Rabbi Meir Omer, Rabbi Meir says, Zayin shvatim shechatu, if you have 7 tribes that sin, bezdin mevian al yedei par, the bezdin is the only one that brings the bull, v'hein paturn, but the tribes are patur, nemar kol lamata, because it says called below, v'nemar kol lamala, and it says call above, ma kol amar lamala bezdin v'lo tzibur, just like when it says call above, it's the court and not the congregation, not the community, af kol amar lamata, so too when it says call below, bezdin v'lo tzibur, it means to say the bezdin, and not the tzibur, not the community. And Rashi explains, hachi darsh Rabbi Meir, here's how Rabbi Meir darshans the pasuk, ma kol ha'amar lamala v'nelam davar me'enei hakol, when it says the eyes of the congregation, bezdin v'lo kol, that actually refers to the court and not the congregation. The idea is that it says from the eyes of the kol, that's a reference just to the bezdin. Kolomar dehorah teluya hi bebezdin, it's saying that the mistaken ruling, that all is dependent upon the court. V'lo b'kol, that has nothing to do with the congregation, they're not the ones issuing the ruling. Tehalo ksiv v'nelam mikol, it doesn't say it's hidden from the kol, ela me'enei hakol, it means to say the eyes of the congregation, meaning to say demashma mi bezdin shall call, that sounds like it's from the court of the congregation, v'lo mikol, not the congregation itself. So therefore, since that's just the court, af kol ha'amar lamata, so too when it says kahol below, v'hikrivu hakol, when it says that the kol brings the offering, bezdin v'lo tzibur, it means to say the court and not the community. And the Brisa continues, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishmo, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he says in the name of Rabbi Meir, Chatu Shisha Shvatim, if 6 of the tribes sin, Vehem Rubo shall call, but they comprise a majority of the whole congregation, O Zayin, or let's say it's 7 of the tribes, Alpha Bisha Eino Rubo shall call, even though they do not comprise a majority of the whole congregation, Mevi and Par, so then they do bring the bull. And according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar from Rabbi Meir, it's the same as Rabbi Meir in terms of the fact that it's the bezdin that brings the par and not the community. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, now analyzing the brisa we just brought above, V'noda hachatos v'lo sheyivadu hachotin. Again, it means to say that the sin is known, but not just that the sinners are known, you have to know exactly what the mistaken ruling was. And the Gemara says, Man Tana, who is the Tana of this part of the brisa? Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, V'itei Marav, and some say that it's Rava that says, the lo Rabbi Eliezer, this part of the brisa is not following Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Monafshach, either way you look at it, Im chaylev ochal chayiv, if he ate chaylev is chayiv, nozer ochal chayiv, if he ate nozer is chayiv. And essentially it's the same idea over here. We'll see Rashi in a moment exactly what Rabbi Eliezer is talking about, but the point is Rabbi Eliezer applies this monafshach. Rabbi Eliezer says, if either way you look at it, there's an obligation, so then you're obligated. And so the same thing should be true with the par helm davar shel tzibur, even though we don't know exactly what the mistaken ruling was, but either way we look at it, there should be an obligation, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer would disagree with the Tana of our brisa, that Rabbi Eliezer would say that there is an obligation to bring the par helam davar shel tzibur. And Rashi explains, Monefshach, either way you look at it, the Tanan Meseches Krisos, we learn in the Mishnah Meseches Krisos, Perak Sofik Achal Chaylev, and Perak Sofik Achal Chaylev, the following case. Chaylev and Noser Lefanav. Let's say a person has in front of him Chaylev and Noser, both of these are prohibited. V'achal as Echad Mehem, he eats one of them. Ve'eno Yodea Eza Mehen Achal. He doesn't know exactly what he ate. Rabbi Eliezer Mechayev Chatos. Rabbi Eliezer says he has to bring a Chatos. Rabbi Yoshua Poter, and Rabbi Yoshua says he's exempt. V'tanyan, we learned in a Brisa, and that's the Brisa we're bringing here. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Manav Shach, Rabbi Eliezer says either way we look at it. Im chaylev achal chayev, im noser achal chayev. If he ain't chaylev, he's chayev. If he ain't noser, he's chayev. So he doesn't know exactly which, but he's going to be chayev ultimately. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua says to him, Harei Omer asher chata ba. It says in the pasuk asher chata ba, ad sheyivada lo b'may chata. He has to know what his sin was. Hachanami. So here also, Svira leila Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer would hold the same thing by the par helam davar shel tzibur. Manav shach. Either way you look at it. Im chaylev achlu b'hora mevi'in par. If they ate chaylev with a mistaken ruling, you bring a par. V'im dam achlu b'hora mevi'in par. If it was blood, also the same thing. If it was by the mistaken ruling, they would bring a par. V'chayav and mimanav shach, and therefore they should be liable. Either way we look at it. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ashi says, Afilu Taim Rabbi Eliezer, you can even say our Brisa is Rabbi Eliezer. Shani Hoch, it's different over here, Dichsiv, because it's written in the Pasuk, Asher Chatu Aleh, since it says, Asher Chatu Aleh, that indicates that they do need to know specifically what the sin was based on which mistaken ruling, in the case of the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibur. But the Gemara says, you can't just say there's a special Pasuk, Hasam Nami, over there also, Haksiv Asher Chata Ba, it says Asher Chata Ba over there as well, and so therefore you can't simply say that the Pasuk tells us that this case is different. The Gemara says, no, hahumi boile, that pasuk of asher chata ba, that can be used for something else, prat l'mesasik, that can be used to exclude a mesasik. And Rashi explains, Afilu Tema Rabbi Eliezer, you can even say it's Rabbi Eliezer. V'shani hoch, it's different over here. Dechsiv v'nota hachatos asher chatu alev yikrivu demashma sheyivad alehem hachet shechatu alev al pi bezin. It's mashma from the pasuk that they need to know exactly the sin that was done through the mistaken ruling of the court. Hasam nami aksiv asher chata ba, but the Gemara says there also it says asher chata ba. Demashma at sheyivad alo b'mechata. There also it's mashma. You have to know exactly what the sin was. And the Gemara then said, no, you can learn that teaches something else. Ba mashma de miskavin la. It's coming, the word ba, it implies that the person has intention to do the sin, and therefore prat l'misasik b'Shabbos. That would exclude, let's say somebody is a misasik on Shabbos. What is misasik? It means that you don't really have intention to do that sin. Kagon, for example, sheneskavin la'agbias atolish. Let's say, for example, the person has intention to pick up something that's already detached from the ground, which would not be prohibited. But then he ends up cutting something that's attached to the ground. The potter, he's potter. And Rashi notes, it happens to be if you're misasik in terms of something where you're going to get some kind of pleasure, some kind of benefit, like chalav and arayos, then you're chayiv shekvar nena, because there you're already getting a benefit, so that's different. Kedamar b'perak daled misas, that's mentioned in Sanhedrin. And the Gemara continues, my time with Rabbi Yehuda, what is the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Again, Rabbi Yehuda says that each tribe is going to bring the par, and also Rabbi Yehuda says that all the other tribes that didn't sin, they bring the par as well. And the Gemara says, kasavarts, because Rabbi Yehuda holds arba kahali ksivi. He says that the word kahal is considered to have been written 4 times, because it says kal hakahal, and kal hakahal, those extra hays count as well, when it says hakahal instead of kahal, and so therefore that's considered a total of 4 times, and we learn something from each. Chad l'chayiv al kol kol v'kol, one of them is to say that each congregation is going to be chayiv, that's each tribe. V'chad l'hora tuluya bebezdin u'maisa toli b'kol, one is to say that when we talk about the mistaken ruling, that of course is done by the courts, and in terms of the action, who acts upon the ruling, that is the action of the congregation. V'chad l'greira, and one of them is to drag, so to speak. It means to drag the other tribes, that even those tribes that didn't sin have to bring the carbon, as Rabbi Yehuda says. V'chad l'shevet sha'asa b'horas bezin, and the other one is, let's say a shevet does, based on the mistaken ruling of its own local court, that also is included in this halacha. And Rashi explains, Dalid kol ksivi, it says kol 4 times, it says me'ene hakol v'hikrivu hakol, it really says hakol twice, it says me'ene hakol and v'hikrivu hakol, delema kra me'ene kahal, but the pasuk could have just said without the hey, me'ene kahal, my hakol, trey, so the fact that it says a hey, that actually counts as 2 kahals. V'lichtov kra v'hikrivu kal, same thing by v'hikrivu, it could just say without a hey, my hakol, what does it say, hakol for a trey, that's also 2, v'arei arba, so the point is the total is 4. Chatas hakol lo kachashiv, Rashi notes that the term chatas hakol, that doesn't even count at all to halok siv lo behora v'lo ba'akrava, because that's not written in the context of the mistaken ruling or in the context of the offering, so it doesn't count. And one of them is l'chayiv al kol kohol v'kol, to say that each congregation is chayiv al kol shevet v'shevet, meaning each tribe is chayiv to bring the par. The shevet echad ikri kol kidam l'kaman, like we'll say later, a shevet is called a kol. V'chad lahora tuluya bebezin. Another one is the idea that the mistaken ruling depends on the court. Kidam la'el hakol v'yasu hora tuluya bebezin umaysa toli v'kol. We said this earlier, that the hora has to do with the court. They issue the mistaken ruling, and then the action is done by the congregation. And then one of them teaches us that the tribes that didn't sin, they get dragged after those that did sin, and each tribe has to bring a bull. And the other one is for the tribe that does based on the mistaken ruling of its local courts. Like we say at the end of the Mishnah, that's what we mentioned at the end of the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, he considers that it just says the word kahal 3 times. Hakohol, kahal, and hakal, those are the 3, meaning one of the hakohols doesn't count as 2, but one of them does. Me'ene hakol, because the term me'ene hakohol, orche dekro, that's just the normal way for the pasuk to speak. That hey belongs there. It's like people say me'ene de planya, from the eyes of so-and-so. You needed to say from the eyes of the congregation. That's what the hey is doing. And so if he only has 3 of them, he learns as follows. Chad l'chayiv al kol kol v'kol. One of them says that each congregation is chayiv, each tribe. Utrei achrini. Now what do you do with the other 2? Nemar lamata kol v'nemar lamala kol. So we learn the following. It says below the word kol, and it says above the word kahal. Ma'alahalon bezdin ima kol. Just like over there, it's the court together with the congregation. Afkan bezdin ima kol. So too over here, it's the court together with the congregation. And Rashi explains, Gimel kol ksivi, it says kol 3 times. Me'ene hakol lo darshinan beitarti. From the words me'ene hakol, we don't count that as 2. The halashimush hu da'asa, because that's coming for the use of the term itself. The orche dekra, that's the normal way of the pasuk. The mishtoi hachi, it speaks in that fashion. Kedamri inchi, just like people say, me'ene de planya, they say from the eyes of so-and-so. Hachanami me'ene hakol, so to over here, from the eyes of the congregation, mashma me'ene shel kol. It's like saying from the eyes of the congregation. V'chadu, that counts as 1. Avol v'hikrivu hakol, but when it says v'ikrivu hakol, darshinan beitrei, that does count as 2. The lichtov kra v'ikrivu kahal, it could have just said v'ikrivu kahal. My hakahal, why does it say with a hey? Trey, so that counts as 2. So hatzlas, that's a total of 3. Chad l'chayiv al kol kol v'kol, one of them it says that chayiv on every single congregation. The Rabbi Shimon nami svirle to shevet echad ikri kol, because Rabbi Shimon also holds that one tribe is called a kol. Ayasri le trei l'gzeira shava nemar kol lamala v'chulu, so he has those 2 extra for that gzeira shava that he makes. And again, the idea of the Gezerah Shava is that just like when it says Me'ene Hakol, that's a reference to both the Bezdin and the congregation. Me'ene is a reference to the Bezdin and Hakol is the congregation. So too by V'hikrivu, by the bringing of the offerings, it's the Bezdin together with the congregation. They both bring the offerings according to Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Meir kahal hakol lo darish. Rabbi Meir, he doesn't darshan the extra hay at all, and so therefore hilkach, therefore trei kol iksivi, it just says call 2 times. Mi boy le lenemar lamata kol v'nemar lamala kol. So he just learns it that it says below the word call, it says above the word kahal. Malahalon bezdin velod sibor. Just like over there, it's the court and not the congregation. Afkan bezdin velod sibor. So too over here, it's the court and not the congregation. This is Rabbi Meir's opinion that only the court is the one that brings the carbon. And again, the explanation of Rabbi Meir was given in this Rashi before of Hachi Darish Rabbi Meir, that when it says Me'ene Hakol, that actually is completely referring to the Bezdin. Me'ene Hakol, the eyes of the congregation is just the Bezdin, and so therefore again it's only the Bezdin that brings the carbon. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar my time, and what's the reason of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Again, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says that if 6 of the tribes sin and they're the majority of the call, or even if 7 of the tribes sin, even if they're not the majority of the call, they bring a par. And the reason of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is ksiv, because it's written in the pasuk v'haya im me'ene ho'eda. The term me'ene ho'eda alma miyuta, that sounds like a minority. The ksiv me'ene, it says me'ene. Or ksiv ki l'cholam b'shgaga, but then it says all of the nation. L'meimra deruba in miyuta lo, that sounds like a majority, yes, and not by a minority. Haketzad, how so? How do we understand? Is it a minority or is it a majority? And the answer is exactly as Rav Shimon ben Elazar said, Asu vav vehein rubo shall call. If 6 of the tribes, if they commit the Aveira, but they comprise a majority of the congregation, O Zayin Afavi she'enon rubo shall call. Let's say 7 of the tribes, even if they're not a majority, chayavin, they will be liable. And Rashi explains, Rav Shimon ben Elazar, my time, it says by the mistaken ruling of Avodah Zara, Beparsha Shlach Nashim and Parsha Shlach, V'haya im me'ene ho'eda. Alma afilu miyuta. Me'ene ho'eda sounds like even a minority. Afilu miyuta chatu mevi'in parav useira. Even if a minority sin, they bring the bull and the he-goat. T'chsev me'ene, because it says me'ene, mashma mixas ene. That sounds like part. V'lo kol ene, not all. T'chsev ki l'chol, but then there's another pasuk that says all of the nation. Mashma deruba in. That sounds like it has to be a majority. Derubo kekulo, because a majority is like the whole thing. Miyuta lo, and a minority would not be obligated. Haketzad, how so, how do we reconcile the two psukim? To me'ene afilu miut kol kagon berov shvatim. Me'ene, which sounds like a minority, that's as long as you have a majority of the tribes, even if it's a minority of the people. V'haidach siv ki l'chol, to be an ruba to call, when it seems to imply in ki l'chol that you need the majority of the congregation, afilu b'miut shvatim, that's even if you have a minority of the tribes. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Hey Amid Beis.